My name is Emily Carter, and I will never forget the day my phone rang just before noon. It was a Tuesday, gray and cold in Boston, and I had been caught between meetings and unanswered emails when the hospital called. They said my mother, Margaret, was in critical condition and that I should come immediately. I dropped everything, not even remembering to shut down my laptop, and ran out as if the building were on fire. The taxi ride felt like a blur of red lights and thoughts I could barely hold together. I gripped my purse so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I remember the driver asked if I was all right, and I only nodded. What could I say? How do you explain that your world is crumbling, and that time has become both your enemy and your only hope? When I arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic and sorrow greeted me like a slap. Nurses moved with that quiet urgency that only hospitals know. At the front desk, they were expecting me. They already had my name written down, as if they'd been counting the minutes until I showed up. A nurse with soft eyes led me to the private room where my mother lay. I could hear the beeping machines before I saw her face. Margaret looked like a ghost of herself, her skin pale, her hair thinner than I remembered. But her presence still commanded the room. Her eyes opened when I stepped in, and for a second, the decades between us disappeared. I sat beside her, taking her hand into mine, and she gripped it with a strength I didn't expect. Her voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but when she spoke, it cut through the quiet like glass. "I'm glad you came, Em," she said, her lips trembling. "I'm here," I replied, trying to sound stronger than I felt. "I'm not going anywhere." The doctor came in shortly after. A man in his late 50s, maybe older, with kind but exhausted eyes. He told me that my mother had less than 24 hours. Her organs were shutting down, and there was nothing more they could do. I nodded like I understood, but I didn't. My mind clung to denial, as if that would change the facts. I stayed by her side through the afternoon. We spoke little. Sometimes, silence says what words cannot. I held her hand and tried to remember every good moment we had, Sunday breakfasts, late-night movies, her laugh when I was being ridiculous. It didn't seem real that this could be the end. Then something shifted. It was around 6 o'clock in the evening when her grip on my hand suddenly tightened. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide with something more than pain. Fear? Urgency? I wasn't sure. Tears welled up, and I saw them slide down her cheeks with effort. "I need to tell you the truth before I go," she said. The room went still. I looked at her, completely thrown off. "What truth, Mom? What do you mean?" She didn't answer right away. Her breathing was heavy, her chest rising in small, shallow motions. But she held on to me as if the strength in her fingers could stop time. I leaned closer, gently brushing her hair from her face. You were chosen," she said, her voice quivering. "There's more, Emily. There's so much more I never told you." My heart started to race. In all our years together, never once had Margaret spoken in riddles or kept secrets. She had always been a constant, calm, grounded, reliable. So why now? Why this? "What do you mean chosen?" I asked, feeling the panic rise in my throat. She closed her eyes, exhausted. Her hand remained in mine, still trembling. I called for the nurse. The doctor returned. They checked her vitals, adjusted her oxygen, and reassured me that the spike in emotion wasn't unusual. But nothing they said mattered. All I could think about was the way she had looked at me. The way her voice cracked on that final word. I stared at her, waiting, praying she would speak again. But she drifted into a fragile sleep, her body too weak to continue. I sat there for hours, unable to move, my mind spinning around that one haunting sentence. I didn't know what she meant. I didn't know what truth she carried. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was going to change everything. The room was darker when I opened my eyes. I must have drifted off in the chair next to her bed, but I wasn't sure for how long. The hum of machines still filled the silence, and outside the window, the city lights blinked like distant stars. I looked at her again, half expecting she would still be asleep, but her eyes were open. "Emily," she whispered. I leaned in quickly, afraid she might slip away before finishing what she had started. Her hand sought mine again, her fingers cold and frail, but still full of urgency. I have to tell you, before it's too late. You're scaring me, Mom, I said. My voice cracked, and I hated how small it sounded. What is it? What truth? She took a shallow breath, her eyes locking with mine. Then, with an effort that seemed to drain her completely, she said, I'm not your real mother. For a moment, I didn't process the words. I just stared at her, my thoughts stumbling over themselves. What are you talking about? I asked, searching her face for any sign that she was confused or hallucinating. But there was no mistaking the clarity in her eyes. They were filled with sorrow and something deeper, guilt, maybe. Or fear. You were brought to me, she said, her voice nearly dissolving into the hum of the machines. I didn't carry you. I didn't give birth to you. I sat back, my breath catching in my throat. Everything inside me screamed to reject what I had just heard. Margaret Carter had raised me, cared for me, loved me. She had been there for every scraped knee, every school recital, every heartbreak. How could she not be my mother? You're delirious, I whispered, as much to myself as to her. They said you might be confused, because of the medication, the stress. No, she interrupted. Her voice was firmer now, but only just. I knew this moment would come. I should have told you sooner. I was afraid. But you need to know, you were chosen. The word hung in the air again, chosen, and it sounded just as strange the second time. Chosen for what? By whom? Why? I couldn't speak. I just stared, stunned, as the nurse entered the room. She had a clipboard in hand and a practiced calm about her. But something in the air must have warned her. She stopped mid-step and looked between us. The tension must have been thick enough to cut. Margaret gave her a glance, barely a twitch of her eyes, and the nurse hesitated. Then, without a word, she stepped out again and closed the door behind her. I turned back, still shaking. Are you saying I'm adopted? Margaret blinked slowly, as if every answer came at a cost. Not exactly. What does that even mean? She looked away, toward the ceiling, her lips moving as if she were silently rehearsing words she'd buried for decades. Then she said, You were left behind. And I took you in. That phrase didn't bring clarity. It only brought more confusion. My hands trembled on my lap, and I clenched them to stop. By who? I asked. Who left me behind? She closed her eyes again. Her chest rose and fell like a fragile wave. There's more, she whispered. But you need to find something first, something at home. I can't say it all now. I stood up, my chair scraping lightly against the floor. You can't just drop this on me and stop there. She tried to speak again, but her voice gave out. The machines kept their steady rhythm, a metronome to the chaos unraveling in my head. I leaned over, trying to keep my voice steady. What do I need to find? Her lips moved without sound. I leaned closer. Behind the photograph, she said. In the hallway. The one of you and me, from the beach. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I turned to go, one hand still gripping the strap of my bag like it was an anchor. But just before I stepped out, I looked back. She was still watching me. Mom, I said, unsure if I still had the right to call her that. But I did. No matter what this truth was, no matter how deep it ran, she had raised me. That counted for something. It had to. Her eyes filled with tears again, and her lips moved one last time. Forgive me. The drive to my mother's house was strangely quiet, even though traffic buzzed around me like any other night in Boston. I barely noticed the honking, the flashing lights, or the familiar intersections. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, my mind chasing fragments of words that refused to form a full picture. You were brought to me. You were chosen. I'm not your real mother. Those words wouldn't stop echoing. The house looked the same as always when I pulled up, the porch light casting a golden glow over the peeling paint, the tiny garden out front untamed but still beautiful in its stubbornness. I hadn't been here in weeks. Maybe longer. I had my own apartment across town, but somehow this place still felt like home. Or at least it had. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and old wood. Familiar. Comforting. I stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the silence press against me. The house, like my memories, felt unchanged. But everything was different now. I walked to the photograph she had mentioned, the one of us on the beach, taken when I was maybe 4 years old. I remembered that day clearly. It had been cold despite the sun, and she had wrapped a towel around me like a cocoon. I was laughing in the picture, squinting into the light. She was behind me, her hands on my shoulders, smiling like nothing else in the world mattered. I lifted the frame from the wall with care, turning it over. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the cardboard backing, sealed with yellowing tape. But then I noticed a small slit at the edge, just enough to slip in something flat. My fingers hesitated, then pulled at the backing until it gave way. Inside, folded tightly and brittle with age, was an envelope. No name. No stamp. Just a date scribbled on the front, April 12, 1993. I sat down on the floor right there in the hallway, heart pounding as I opened it. The first thing I saw was a birth certificate, my name printed across the top, but not the way I expected. It read Emily Monroe. The surname was unfamiliar. Beneath it, the mother's name, Isabel Monroe. I stared at it, reading and rereading the letters like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Isabel Monroe. A name I had never heard before. A name my mother, Margaret, had never spoken. There were other papers, too, hospital forms, some half-filled, others stamped and signed. A discharge sheet with dates that matched my birth year. Then something else, a typewritten letter, smudged and slightly torn at the edge. I unfolded it slowly. It was from a law office, Riley and Associates, signed by someone named Thomas Riley. The content was vague, but it referenced a private arrangement and a request for confidentiality. It didn't say anything directly about adoption, but the implications were clear. Words like guardianship, discretion, and placement danced around the truth like shadows avoiding light. I read the letter twice. Then a third time. My hands began to sweat, and I felt the paper stick to my fingers. Why had none of this ever been mentioned? Why had Margaret hidden it behind a picture of us smiling? I sat there for a long time. My legs were numb. My head felt heavy with questions. I looked again at the name Isabel Monroe. It rang no bell. No distant memory stirred. But something about it felt suddenly important, like a locked door creaking open. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the envelope, tucking it under my coat. The air in the house had shifted. It no longer felt warm or safe. It felt like the inside of a memory I wasn't sure belonged to me. When I got back to the hospital, the halls seemed even more sterile than before. I moved quickly through them, clutching the envelope like it might disappear if I loosened my grip. But when I reached the room, everything inside me froze. My mother, Margaret, was no longer awake. Her body lay still, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. The nurse looked up as I entered, then glanced away with that practiced sympathy. "She's sleeping," she said softly. "Her body's very tired." I wanted to scream. To shake her awake. To demand the rest of the truth she had started to share. But all I could do was sit back down and hold the envelope in my lap, its weight unbearable now. I didn't know who Isabel Monroe was. I didn't know what had really happened in April of 1993. But I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. I barely slept that night. I stayed at the hospital, curled in the same chair, with the envelope clutched to my chest like a lifeline. Nurses came and went, checking machines, whispering to each other. No one asked me to leave. Maybe they could see in my face that I wouldn't, even if they had. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Not just as she was now, frail and fading, but as the woman who raised me, the woman who taught me to ride a bike, who brushed my hair before school, who made hot chocolate when I cried over heartbreaks. And yet, beneath those memories, something else pulsed like a second heartbeat. A name, Isabel Monroe. And a truth I still didn't understand. It was just past 7 o'clock in the morning when she stirred. At first, I thought it was the sound of the machines. But then I saw her hand twitch. Her fingers curled slightly, and her lips moved, dry and cracked but forming shapes. I jumped from the chair and leaned in. "Mom?" I whispered. I didn't know what else to call her. The word still came naturally. Her eyes fluttered open. They looked glassy at first, as if she were still in a dream. Then they focused on me. "You found it," she murmured. I nodded quickly. I did. I found the envelope. Who is Isabel Monroe? She closed her eyes again. For a moment I thought she might drift back into unconsciousness, but then she spoke, each word measured, her breath short. "She was so young," she said. "Barely more than a girl. I was visiting a friend who worked in the hospital. That's how it started." My mind raced to keep up. "You met her at the hospital?" She nodded faintly. "She was alone. No family. No one. She just had a baby." Her voice broke. "You." I felt my chest tighten. "She left?" I asked. "She disappeared," she said. "The night after she gave birth. No warning. Just gone. She didn't sign any papers. Didn't even leave a note." There was chaos. The hospital didn't know what to do. I leaned closer. "So how did I end up with you?" She licked her lips, her voice now barely more than breath. "A man. A lawyer. Thomas Riley. He called me. Said they needed someone. A temporary guardian, just until things could be figured out." I remembered the name from the letter. "But it wasn't temporary, was it?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw the full weight of her guilt. "No," she whispered. "It wasn't." I swallowed hard, the air thick around us. "You didn't go through the adoption process?" She shook her head slowly. "Thomas said it would be cleaner if we didn't involve the courts. Said he'd handle it all privately. I didn't ask questions. I wanted you." I stared at her, the pieces starting to fall into place, jagged and sharp. "So you just took me home?" As if I were left behind. Tears slid down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them. I knew it wasn't right. "But you were so small. So perfect. I couldn't let you go." I stood up, pacing the corner of the room. My hands were shaking, and I felt heat rising in my chest. "You didn't think I had a right to know? All these years?" "I wanted to tell you," she said. "So many times. But I was afraid. Afraid I'd lose you. Afraid you'd hate me." I turned to face her. "And Isabel? What happened to her?" She looked away. Her voice dropped even lower. "That's not all I know. But I wasn't the only one who knew. Someone else, someone you might remember." I narrowed my eyes. "Who?" She hesitated. Her mouth moved without sound. Then, finally, she said it. "Sarah Bennett." The name landed like a stone in my chest. I hadn't heard it in years. She had been our neighbor when I was a teenager, always quiet, always watching. I remembered her red coat, her neat garden, the way she always seemed to know more than she let on. "She knew?" I asked. "She knew Isabel. They were friends, once. I think she might know where Isabel went. Or what happened after." My mind spun, too full of names, years, missing pieces. But I knew one thing with certainty, I needed answers. "Do you think Isabel's still alive?" I asked. Margaret didn't answer. She closed her eyes, too exhausted to speak. A machine beeped slowly beside her. Her fingers slipped from mine. I didn't know if she would wake up again. But I knew where I had to go next. Sarah Bennett. I left the hospital before noon, walking as if the ground beneath me had changed. I didn't even feel the wind as I made my way down the street. My mind was caught in a loop. She just took me home. No court, no process. Just took me. The name Sarah Bennett pulsed in my thoughts. I hadn't seen her in over a decade, not since I left for college and Mom sold the house. But I remembered her. She was quiet, careful. The kind of woman who saw everything but said nothing. I found her current address online with little effort, just one town over, still in Massachusetts. Something about that felt strange. She had always kept to herself, but she hadn't gone far. I drove there that same afternoon, needing answers like oxygen. Her house was small and plain, with ivy curling up one side. I rang the bell with hesitation, then stepped back as the door opened. When she saw me, she froze. "Emily?" she asked. I nodded. "I need to talk to you." She looked over her shoulder, then stepped aside. I knew this day would come. Inside, everything was still and perfectly arranged. The air smelled faintly of lemon and paper. I followed her into a room lined with bookshelves. She sat, motioning for me to do the same. "I saw Margaret 2 weeks ago," she said before I even asked. She looked tired. Like she'd been carrying something for too long. "She told me," I said. "About Isabel Monroe. About the lawyer. About me." Sarah sighed, her face unreadable. "She loved you. Don't forget that, no matter what else you learn." I nodded, but the ache in my chest only grew. "I need to know who Isabel was." Do you know where she went?" Sarah hesitated. Then she stood, walked slowly to a cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a small wooden box. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed with time. "She came to me in 2001, Sarah said. Tried to reach Margaret. But your mother, she wasn't ready. Isabel left this with me. Told me to keep it safe." My fingers trembled as I took the envelope. On the front, in faded ink, was my name. My name in her handwriting. Just that was enough to stop my breath. Emily, written in delicate cursive, the kind that came from another time. I held the envelope like it might crumble in my hands. Sarah said nothing, just watched me with those steady, quiet eyes. "May I?" I asked. She nodded once. I opened it slowly. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. I unfolded it, my heart pounding as if it already knew what I'd find. The letter was dated June 21, 2001. I must have been 8 years old. "Dear Emily, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe you'll never know who I am. But I am your mother, your first mother. And I want you to know that I never stopped thinking of you. When I left that hospital, I wasn't running from you. I was running from something much darker. I was scared. Alone. I did what I thought would keep you safe. I only hope that you've been loved. I hope you've had a beautiful life. If you ever want to find me, I'll be waiting. Love always." Isabel. At the bottom of the page was an address. Not in Massachusetts. Not even close. Portland, Oregon. I read it again, trying to picture her face. I had nothing. No image, no voice, no memory. Just a name. Isabel Monroe. But now there was something else, a direction. "I have to go," I said. Sarah nodded. "I know." As I stood to leave, she reached out and touched my arm. "There's more, Emily. But you're not ready for all of it." "Not yet." I met her gaze. "Tell me anyway." She hesitated. Isabel didn't stay in Portland. She left again. To care for her mother, I think. But there's someone who might still remember her there. A neighbor. That's how I got the address. Do you know the name? I asked. Sarah shook her head. No. But it's where your trail begins. I stepped out of her house into the fading afternoon light. Everything felt suspended, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. I didn't know who Isabel really was. I didn't know what I would find. But I knew this: I was going to Portland. I booked the flight that same night. There was no plan, no script, just the letter in my bag and a name that had begun to fill every corner of my mind. Isabel. My mother. My other mother. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop imagining what it would be like to see her face, to hear her voice. What would she say if she opened the door and saw me standing there? The flight to Portland was long, but I barely noticed the time. My thoughts were louder than the engines. I kept reading and rereading her letter. Each sentence felt like a thread tying me to someone I had never met but somehow always carried with me. I arrived in Oregon under heavy clouds and rented a small car. The address Isabel had written down was in a quiet neighborhood on the east side of the city, not far from the river. The houses were old but well kept, surrounded by tall trees and silent porches. I parked across the street and stared at the house for a long time. It was empty. The windows were dark, the yard unkempt. A faded for sale sign leaned crookedly in the front lawn. I walked up the steps anyway and knocked. Nothing. I peered inside. Dusty floors. A curtain moving slightly with the wind. A neighbor noticed me and came over cautiously. She was an older woman, maybe in her 70s, wearing a thick sweater despite the warm day. Are you looking for someone? She asked. I hesitated. I'm trying to find Isabel Monroe. She lived here, I think. The woman's expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. She did, she said. Years ago. Moved in with her mother when she got sick. Sweet woman. Quiet. Didn't stay long. Do you know where she went? The woman looked down. No. But I remember she started using another last name. I saw it once on a letter. Hawthorne. Isabel Hawthorne. The name hit me like a new key in a locked door. I thanked her and returned to the car, my pulse racing. Isabel Hawthorne. I had something new to follow. I went through public records the rest of the day, searching every corner of the internet. It took hours. I found nothing at first, just hints, possible leads that led nowhere. Then, finally, a listing in a teacher's directory from Vermont. Isabel Hawthorne, retired, formerly an educator in Windham County. There was a phone number. I stared at it for a long time before dialing. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then someone picked up. Hello, a woman's voice answered, older, cautious. I swallowed hard. Hi. I'm looking for Isabel Hawthorne. There was a pause. Who's calling? My mouth went dry. My name is Emily. I think I might be her daughter. Silence. Then a sharp inhale. Emily, she said. Her voice trembled. Are you my daughter? And then the line went dead. I sat in silence, the dial tone echoing in my ear. There was no more doubt. I was going to Vermont. The next morning, I packed a small bag, filled the gas tank, and left Portland behind with the sunrise at my back. I could have flown to Vermont, but something about this part of the journey felt like it needed to be done on the road. I needed the space, the silence, the time to think. I needed to feel every mile stretch between who I had been and who I was becoming. The road carried me east through forests, mountains, and endless stretches of highway that seemed to blur together. I drove through the days and slept in roadside motels at night, unable to fully rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, Isabel, though I had no image of her to draw from. Just a name, a voice that had broken through the static of time and distance to say, "Are you my daughter?" It took me 3 days to reach the small town in Vermont where the directory had listed her. Windham County was quiet, tucked between wooded hills and winding roads, the kind of place where every mailbox bore a family name and every corner store still sold newspapers. I stopped in front of the address I had found. A small, 2-story house with blue shutters and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. I sat in the car for a full 5 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Then I stepped out. The porch steps groaned under my feet as I approached. I raised my hand to knock, but the door opened before I could. She stood there, frozen. Her hair was gray now, pulled back into a loose braid. Her eyes were wide, lips parted, breath held. I didn't need her to speak. I knew. Isabel. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then her hand flew to her mouth, and she stepped back as if overwhelmed by the sight of me. "I wasn't sure," she whispered. "I didn't know if you'd really come." I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. "I wasn't sure either." She motioned for me to come in. I stepped over the threshold into a living room that smelled of cedar and dried lavender. The furniture was modest, the walls filled with framed photographs, not of me, of course, but of students, nature, a life lived quietly. We sat down on opposite ends of the couch. The air between us was heavy with everything unsaid. "I don't know where to start," she said finally. "Start with the truth," I replied. "All of it." She nodded slowly. "I was 20 when I got pregnant. No partner. My mother had just been diagnosed with early-onset dementia. I was working 2 jobs, barely surviving. I thought I could do it. I wanted to. But when I went into labor early, I panicked. I had no one to call. No money. No plan." She looked down at her hands. "The birth was complicated. There were problems. They wouldn't let me see you right away. I was scared and ashamed. I left. I told myself I'd come back the next day, when I had the courage." She looked up, eyes shining. "But when I came back, you were gone." I leaned forward. "Gone?" "The hospital said you'd been placed into emergency care. That a woman had taken you in temporarily. Margaret Carter." I felt her name strike like a bell. "I tried to reach her," Isabel continued. "Wrote letters. Called the hospital. They told me it was out of their hands. I wasn't legally tied to you. No paperwork. No custody. And you never found her?" She shook her head. "I tried for years. But she moved. Changed numbers. Eventually, I thought, maybe it was better. Maybe you had a good life." I thought of Margaret, how fiercely she had loved me, how much she had feared losing me. And I saw Isabel's grief etched into her face like time hadn't let her forget. "You could have fought," I said, my voice softer than I intended. She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I was weak. But I never stopped loving you. Not one day." We sat in silence, not as strangers anymore, but not quite as mother and daughter either. Something in between. Something fragile, waiting to become real. Just as I stood to leave, she reached out and touched my arm. "There's one more thing," she said. "Something Margaret may never have told you." I turned to her. "What?" She hesitated. "She didn't steal you, Emily. She saved you. There was something very wrong with the man who arranged that private adoption. And I think Margaret knew." I froze. I didn't respond right away. Her words, "She didn't steal you. She saved you," echoed in my head, refusing to settle. I sat back down, unsure of whether I wanted to hear what came next. Part of me was still that child who believed my life had been simple, that love had been enough. But love, I was learning, could be complicated. And sometimes, it could be desperate. What do you mean? I asked finally. Isabel's hands were folded tightly in her lap. Thomas Riley, the lawyer. The one who helped arrange everything with Margaret? I didn't know him at the time. But after I lost you, I started asking questions. She stood and walked to a shelf, pulling down an old file folder, thick with papers and notes. She handed it to me. I opened it slowly. Articles. Court transcripts. Redacted documents. My eyes scanned headlines: illegal adoption network under investigation, Boston attorney accused of unlawful placements, suspected child trafficking ring tied to private legal practice. My breath caught. This was real? I asked, stunned. He was involved in selling children? Isabel nodded grimly. It was never officially confirmed. Most of it got buried. But I found enough to understand the pattern. Desperate mothers. Quiet deals. No oversight. He used his position to arrange illegal transfers of custody. Some ended up in horrible places. My stomach turned. I thought of how close I had come to being someone else's story, someone who didn't get lucky. Who wasn't loved. Then why did he give me to Margaret? I asked. Margaret knew someone at the hospital, Isabel said. She had been trying to adopt, I think. Legitimately. But the system was slow. Overwhelming. When Riley saw the opportunity, he reached out to her. She wasn't part of his circle, but he used her desperation. I swallowed hard. She never told me any of this. She might not have known the full extent, Isabel replied. But I think she suspected something. And when she saw you, maybe she just couldn't let go. I stared down at the documents again, the weight of their contents settling over me like cold fog. My life, so carefully built on the illusion of certainty, was now revealed to have begun with silence, secrets, and illegal acts. And yet, somehow, I had been one of the fortunate ones. Is he still alive? I asked. Isabel shook her head. No. He died in 2008. Heart attack. No formal charges were ever filed. I exhaled slowly, feeling something between relief and disappointment. There would be no confrontation. No justice. Just truth, late and heavy. I stood up and looked around the room again, this time noticing the small things. The framed photos of children that weren't me. A well-used rocking chair near the window. A faded stuffed rabbit on a shelf. Pieces of a life I'd never been part of, but that, in some ways, had waited for me. I need to go back, I said. Isabel looked up, startled. Already? I nodded. I have to see Margaret. She's still in the hospital. And now I understand more than I did before. I expected her to argue, to ask me to stay longer. But she only said, if you see her again, tell her thank you. For me. I promised I would. The next morning, I drove back to Boston. The miles felt longer this time, but clearer. My head was still spinning with everything I had learned, but my heart was beginning to settle. I had found my beginning, no matter how messy or broken. And I had found something else too, a piece of myself I never knew was missing. When I arrived at the hospital, I hurried through the doors, clutching the folder of documents. The nurse at the front desk looked up, recognizing me. She's still in the same room, she said gently. I nodded, almost running to the elevator. But when I reached the floor and walked into the room, everything stopped. Margaret was lying still, eyes closed, her skin pale. A machine beeped softly beside her, but not urgently. Not anymore. The nurse looked at me with quiet sympathy. She slipped into a deep coma last night. We don't know if she'll wake again. I stood by her side, my hands trembling, tears burning the corners of my eyes. I found her, I whispered. I found Isabel. And I know the truth. But Margaret didn't move. Her breathing was shallow. Her hand rested quietly on the blanket. I took it gently into mine. I forgive you. I stayed by Margaret's bedside until the sun disappeared behind the buildings outside her window. The lights in the room dimmed as the city darkened, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. I kept hoping she'd stir, open her eyes, whisper my name one more time. But her chest rose and fell in the same soft rhythm, her body now more shadow than presence. The folder with Riley's documents was still on the chair next to me. I hadn't opened it again. There was nothing more I needed to read. The truth had already done its work. By morning, I left the hospital and returned home briefly, if only to collect my thoughts, shower, and change into clean clothes. My apartment felt unfamiliar now. The framed photos on the walls, the books on the shelves, even the old sweater I threw on, it all belonged to a version of me that had existed before the unraveling began. Then I called Isabel. I wasn't sure what I would say, only that I needed to speak to her again. Her voice was soft when she answered, cautious at first, then warmed by recognition. Emily? I want to see you again, I said. When? Today. She didn't hesitate. I'll be here. I drove north that afternoon. The route back to Vermont felt strangely different this time, no longer an escape, but a return. A step towards something unfinished. My hands gripped the wheel with a steadiness I hadn't felt in days. When I arrived, Isabel opened the door before I could knock. She was wearing the same blue sweater from our last meeting. Her face was gentler this time, as if the shock had softened into quiet hope. We didn't speak right away. She opened her arms, and I stepped into them. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was simple. Two people who had waited too long to hold each other. We sat in the living room, just like before, and this time she brought out photo albums. Not of me, of course, but of her life, the years I had missed. She showed me pictures of the classroom she used to teach in, of the Vermont winters, of a small garden she once kept. There were letters from former students, gifts from neighbors. A life shaped around the absence of something too painful to name. I kept myself busy, she said, flipping through the pages. It was the only way I knew how to keep from falling apart. I listened. I asked questions. We laughed once, awkwardly, when she told me how bad she was at math, even as a teacher. The weight between us shifted. It didn't disappear, but it became something we could carry together. I used to wonder, I said, what my life would have been like if I'd grown up with you. She looked at me, her eyes suddenly wet. And I used to wonder if you were happy. I was, I said, and it was true. Despite the secrets, despite everything, I had been loved. She reached for my hand. Then that's what matters most to me. We sat like that for a long time. No more questions. No more explanations. Just silence, the kind that comes not from discomfort, but from peace. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door. You can come back, she said softly. Anytime. I turned to face her. There's still so much we don't know about each other. She smiled. Then we'll have time to learn. Just before I reached my car, she called out to me. Wait. There's something I almost forgot. I walked back. She disappeared. Inside and returned with a small box. Inside it was a baby blanket, faded pink with tiny stars stitched along the edges. I made this before you were born, she said. I never got to use it. But I held onto it all these years. I touched the fabric carefully. It was soft, delicate. Somehow, it felt like a piece of myself I didn't know had been missing. Thank you, I whispered. As I drove back through the Vermont hills, the blanket folded beside me, I felt something shift inside. Not closure, this wasn't an ending. But maybe it was the beginning of a different kind of wholeness. And still, I couldn't stop thinking of Margaret. I had found Isabel, yes. I had uncovered the truth. But I hadn't told her everything. Not yet. And time was slipping away. I returned to the hospital the next morning, the pink blanket still folded in my bag. Something about carrying it made me feel closer to both women, as if part of my past had finally found its place in the present. I didn't know what I was expecting when I walked through those doors again. Hope had become such a fragile thing lately. Margaret was still in the same condition. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, her body unmoving. A nurse sat quietly in the corner, reading a chart. She looked up and nodded as I entered, then stepped out, giving me space. I sat down beside the bed, took her hand in mine, and started to speak. I wasn't sure what words would come, but they did, quietly, slowly, and without force. I saw her, I whispered. I found Isabel. There was no reaction, but I kept going. She told me everything. About the hospital. About how scared she was. How she came back and you were already holding me. I paused, feeling the weight of it all. She said she never stopped thinking about me. But she also said you didn't just take me, you protected me. For a long time, I had been caught between two truths. One where Margaret had stolen me. Another where she had saved me. Now I understood they were both true, and neither were simple. I reached into my bag and placed the blanket on Margaret's lap. She kept this, I said. All these years. Just like you kept every drawing I made, every school photo, every birthday card. Still, Margaret didn't stir. But somehow, I felt she could hear me. I know about Thomas Riley, I said. I know he wasn't just helping people. He was doing something terrible. And you, my voice broke. You saw what was happening. You stepped into it. You didn't do everything right, but you gave me a life. A real one. You loved me when no one else was there. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Not yet. I forgive you, I whispered. And I love you. Nothing you say or don't say will change that now. As I sat there, her hand resting in mine, a soft knock came at the door. I turned, expecting the nurse, but it wasn't. It was Isabel. She stepped into the room slowly, her eyes wide with emotion. I wasn't sure if I should come, she said, her voice quiet. But I needed to. For her. For us. I stood, unsure of what to do, but I stepped aside. Isabel walked over to Margaret's bed and looked down at the woman who had raised her daughter. Her hands trembled, and for a long moment, she just stared. Then she reached out and touched Margaret's shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. For giving her what I couldn't. I watched as Isabel leaned forward and kissed Margaret's forehead gently. It was the softest, most complicated moment I had ever witnessed, grief and gratitude tangled together in complete silence. She didn't take you to hurt me, Isabel said, turning to me. She saved you from something I didn't even know was coming. Riley's network, it was worse than we thought. If Margaret hadn't stepped in, you might have disappeared. Forever. That word, disappeared, echoed like a warning from another life. Do you think she knew what Riley really was? I asked. Isabel nodded slowly. Not everything. But enough to fear it. Enough to go around the law and hold on to you with everything she had. I looked back at Margaret, at the way her body rested now like a story nearly at its end. She never told me, I said. She didn't want you to carry the weight, Isabel replied. So she carried it alone. And now that truth belonged to both of us. I didn't know if Margaret would ever wake again. But if she didn't, I needed her to know that the truth had been found. That it hadn't broken me. It had set me free. 2 days after Isabel visited the hospital, the machines began to slow. Her breathing faded like a candle's last flicker, soft and unannounced. I was there when it happened. Holding her hand, whispering the same words over and over again, thank you, I forgive you, I love you, until her chest stilled and the room grew impossibly silent. The nurse touched my shoulder gently, then stepped out to give me space. I sat with her body for a long time, not crying, not speaking. Just existing with the ache of a goodbye I had both feared and somehow already accepted. In the days that followed, everything moved with quiet urgency. Paperwork. Phone calls. The funeral arrangements. I didn't feel real during any of it. I walked through those days like someone observing their own life from a distance. Then came the day I returned to Margaret's house to begin the impossible task of sorting through what she left behind. Her bedroom smelled just like her, lavender and cedar, the scent of time and habit. Her closet was neatly arranged, her drawers carefully folded. There was something sacred about it all, like every item was a piece of who she was. I moved slowly, opening boxes, touching familiar textures, brushing dust from forgotten corners. And then, in the bottom drawer of her writing desk, I found it. An envelope addressed in her handwriting, to Emily. For when I am gone. I stared at it for a long time, the weight of its existence almost too much to hold. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter, written in blue ink, in the same careful script she used for birthday cards and grocery lists. My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, then my time has come. And there are things I still need to say, not just as your mother, but as the woman who loved you enough to carry this secret for far too long. You were not born from me, but you were mine in every way that mattered. I held you when you cried, I laughed with you when you danced in the living room, I watched you become someone I never could have dreamed of. You made my life fuller than I ever thought possible. I didn't tell you the truth because I was afraid. Afraid that you would see me differently. That you would hate me. But mostly, I was afraid that telling you would make me lose you. I couldn't bear that. Not after everything. You were left behind once, not by choice, but by pain. I only wanted to make sure you were never left again. I know you've probably found Isabel. I hope you did. She deserves to know you, just as you deserve to know her. I never stopped thinking of her, even when I tried to pretend it was all just in the past. Please forgive me for the years I kept this from you. I would give anything to have one more day to say these words out loud. But if this letter is all I have left, then let it carry every ounce of love I have ever felt for you. You are the greatest gift of my life. With all my love, Mom. I read it once. Then again. And again. Each word carved deeper into my heart, both mending and breaking it in equal measure. I pressed the letter to my chest and finally allowed myself to cry, loud, full, uncontrollable tears that no longer needed to be held in. Later, as I prepared for the funeral, I found myself placing both letters, the one from Isabel, and now this one from Margaret, into the same small wooden box. I didn't know where they would eventually belong. Only that they belonged together. Like the women who wrote them. Like the pieces of myself they each held. The funeral was quiet, held in the same chapel where Margaret had once taken me to light candles on cold Sundays. Isabel sat in the back, quietly, respectfully, a scarf over her hair. We didn't speak much that day, but our eyes met, and that was enough. No blame. No regrets. Just recognition. After the service, I stayed behind as the others filtered out. I approached the casket one last time, holding a single photograph in my hand. It was the picture I had found buried in Margaret's drawer the night before, one I had never seen before. In it, Margaret stood beside Isabel. They were younger, maybe late 20s. They stood near a hospital wall, arms barely touching, a quiet, tired look in both their eyes. It must have been taken the day I was born. A moment they had never spoken about. A memory hidden in plain sight. I placed the photo gently on top of the casket and leaned in. You both loved me, I whispered. And that love saved me. Then I placed a small bouquet of white lilies beside it. And I walked out into the sunlight. It took me weeks to find rhythm again after Margaret's funeral. Even the smallest routines, making coffee, opening the blinds, checking the mailbox, felt unfamiliar. Grief didn't arrive as a storm. It crept in like fog, settling quietly into everything. But with time, something else began to grow beside the ache, understanding. I visited Isabel a week later. This time, I brought the wooden box with the letters. I placed it on her kitchen table, and we sat together in silence before opening it. She read Margaret's letter slowly, her fingers brushing over every word. When she finished, she didn't cry. She simply whispered, "She loved you as fiercely as I wanted to." I nodded. She did. And so do you. We didn't need to define it. There was no neat title, no label for the way love had stitched itself into two separate lives that had once collided and then waited to be repaired. From that day on, I began to visit Isabel regularly. At first it was quiet, cautious tea on Sundays, walks by the river, slowly unearthing the fragments of years lost. She showed me photos from her teaching days. I brought her stories from mine. We didn't rush the bond, we simply let it unfold. One afternoon, I found a journal Margaret had kept in a locked drawer I'd almost missed. It was filled with small reflections, simple entries about me growing up. My first steps. My fear of thunder. The day I brought home a stray kitten. In every sentence, there was a tenderness that made me ache with love and sorrow. In the final pages, she had written something that stayed with me. If one day she finds Isabel, I hope she doesn't choose between us. I hope she understands that love is not divided by truth. It is deepened by it. I copied that line into my own journal. In the spring, I drove back to the cemetery alone. The grass had grown soft and green around Margaret's grave. I knelt down and placed a fresh bouquet of violets, her favorite, on the stone. Alongside them, I left a folded note with only one line: "You gave me love when I needed it most. And that matters more than anything." Then I placed the photo of the two women, Margaret and Isabel, arms nearly touching, beneath the flowers. They had both carried so much for me. Secrets. Fears. Love. They had both lost pieces of themselves in the name of protecting mine. And in their own way, they had both returned me to who I truly was. Not one mother. Not the other. Both. As I stood and stepped back, I felt the weight in my chest shift. Not disappear, but transform. The pain of truth had made space for something else, wholeness. And from that day forward, I lived differently. I began writing our story, Margaret's, Isabel's, mine. Not for publication. Not for the world. But because some stories need to be remembered to be understood. Because memory is not a photograph or a document. It's the echo of love carried in the choices we make. And in those pages, I wrote one final truth: I had two mothers. One who gave me life. And one who gave me love. And neither version of myself would ever exist without both of them.